what we'll do now is get into the formal presentations. And our first talk, like I mentioned, will be by Wayne Shepperd and John Guyon, and is entitled Massive Aspen Die-Off in the Western U.S., What is Going On? And they're going to do a tag team presentation, and it'll be interesting to see how this works out. But just a little, I'm not going to give a lot of details on these speakers because most of it is in your packet. But Wayne is a silviculturist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins. He holds a BS in outdoor recreation, MS and PhD in silviculture from Colorado State. He's a Colorado native that has worked with the Forest Service for 69 years, and this is... Is that right?
I'm old, but I'm not that old.
Okay. And this is the sad part. He will be retiring in January. He has conducted research on Aspen since the 70s. And it's outlasted most or not all of his contemporaries to become a recognized Aspen geezer. I guess I'm the other one. John Guyon is a forest pathologist and spent 15 years with the FHP, Forest Health Protection in Ogden. He did his master's at Colorado State on stress and canker diseases on aspen, particularly aspen regeneration. So I'll turn the time over to them now, and we'll see how this all turns out.
All righty. Well, the topic we're going to discuss is the die-off that Dale mentioned and the current hullabaloo about this. Basically, what's going on. So I think John's going to go through first a working definition of decline to sort of give some terminology to base our presentation on here.
Okay, and I hate to differ with Dale, but I'm going to offer you guys a slightly different definition of what a forest decline is. And my perspective on this is I am a forest pathologist. And to a forest pathologist, a forest decline is a previously defined thing. And I'm going to give you that definition, not necessarily just to differ with Dale, because what he's working with is very obviously the phenomenon that's been going on for a lot of years, but just to propose the forest pathologist definition of what a forest decline is as a conceptual framework to try and explain some of the kind of trickier things that are happening out there with aspen right now, particularly some of the major die-off events that we've been seeing in the last couple of years. So towards that end, I'm going to give you a definition of a forest decline. Okay, and to a forest pathologist, a forest decline is a kind of a disease. It's one that involves multiple factors. They can be abiotic or biotic, but you have many things going on at the same time. So it's not a nice simple scenario that you can explain with one or two factors like grazing pressure or forest succession. This is a kind of a definition that works for when you have these more complex and more complicated type things going on. I highlighted the word gradual up there, and declines are something that usually take a period of time. Could be in some cases decades, could be something that's happening over just a couple of years, but it is something that evolves over a longer period of time, and it's not just a real quick whack like some of the other things that Wayne's going to be talking about here in a few minutes. It does involve a number of different factors. Those factors are interchangeable, meaning like, for example, on one spot you could get one disease playing a particular role. In another place you could have a different disease or insect or other agent that is playing exactly the same role. Okay? They are also interactive. I'm going to talk in just a minute about the kind of different layers to this type of a definition. And there is an order to something if it's going to be looked at as a forest decline. Okay, one kind of the credos of talking about forest declines is that you rule out the easy things, the single factors first. If you have an easy definition of the problem, like you have heavy grazing pressure in the area, it's simpler and more direct to just call that grazing pressure and not worry about whether or not it's a decline type phenomenon. Okay, one other term that I wanted to define here for the purposes of this presentation is what is a dieback? And that's a word that gets knocked around an awful lot too, like Aspen decline does. And a dieback, to me and to someone with pathology background and training, is just simply something that is killing off a portion of the plant that you're dealing with. When you're dealing with a clonal species like aspen, it actually is kind of an interesting and tricky to define what is a dieback, because you can actually have almost all the overstory gone on a particular site, and that's still just a dieback. You still have the clonal root system in place, and even if you lose all of the overstory, what have you really lost? You've lost something that's actually fairly disposable to that clone as a whole. So dieback, for the purposes of discussion today, is just something that's taking off some portion of the plant. Oh, and dieback can lead to decline, but doesn't necessarily have to lead to decline. In a lot of cases, you can have a dieback event that actually stimulates a clone by removing the overstory and stimulating new sucker production. Okay, also the final point here is that decline, the way that I'm looking at it here, is something that affects clones. It does not affect individual stems. And you really think about it, an individual stem to an aspen clone is really a pretty disposable entity. Okay, and talk about 3 or more sets of factors that fall into actually these 3 categories. I'm going to talk about predisposing type factors, and those are things that are chronic. They happen over a long period of time. A couple of classic examples of predisposing type factors would be a long-term drought, or even old age of aspen clones could be considered a predisposing type factor in the definition of a forest decline. Inciting factors are something that comes in and it's a big whack in a short period of time. A good example of that would be something like a sudden defoliation type event. But inciting things are something that comes in and makes a pretty consequential change in the health of that aspen clone in a short period of time. Okay, finally, contributing factors. These are things that are always out there. A great example of these on any aspen clones are things like canker diseases. I can take you out into any aspen clone anywhere in the western United States, and if I can get out enough trees, I guarantee you can find canker diseases. They're always there. So that's the kind of role that those pathogens, organisms are playing. There's something that is usually an indicator of a weakened host, but they're almost always there. One other point I wanted to make along with this definition is that severity of these different factors can influence the speed of decline. If you get a big enough episode of an inciting factor, some clones can die in a relatively short period of time. A great example of this is what's happened down in Arizona, where they had a big frost episode that came in a relatively short period of time, killed off all the foliage, and caused some little stem and twig dieback. So you had this really big whack that came in a short period of time. Well, those clones declined and died within only a couple of years if you get a big enough inciting type factor impacting the health of the clone. There is somewhat of a tipping point, I think, in this equation. If you get severe enough damage, it's probably easier just to describe it as a single type event. But if you get a slightly less severe damage, you could have a chain of events started that leads to a decline type phenomenon. Okay, with that, I'm going to kick it to you, Wayne, and he's going to talk about some die-off events.
Okay, here's some factors that where die-off, as we're describing it, differ from normal aspen decline. The first is that mature trees die quickly, within a year or two. It's a rapid mortality. Secondly, there's little or no new sprouting evidence after the fact, after we notice the decline. Sometimes there's sprouts that occur in the understory or a younger cohort present that sometimes survive, but we see little or no new sprouting in many of these instances. Lateral roots may therefore be affected. The parent root system of the aspen clone may be affected. In fact, we have done limited amounts of excavation in Colorado and found no live roots under a couple of these clones, but I emphasize that was very limited, so more work needs to be done. Die-off seems to begin in epicenters and spread radially through the affected aspen stands, sometimes stopping at clonal boundaries, other times it's less clear as to whether it's stopping at clonal boundaries. Stands on all topographic positions, moisture regimes, and soil types are affected. There's no one type of situation that seems to be conducive or immune, if you will, to this dieback phenomenon. Die-off can affect one clone and leave an adjacent clone unaffected, so that's been observed at times as well. Younger age classes and advanced regeneration are often not affected to the same extent as overstory trees, and we'll see some examples of that. A number of factors have been associated with die-off epicenters, including the diseases, most particularly Cytospora and Synangium. I believe John has some pictures of that later. Poplar borers and other damage that he's going to show you. History and magnitude of the die-off, aspen die-off, has been reported throughout Western North America. The Canadians have been studying this for a number of years. They're convinced it's related to drought in Canada, but it's running literally from Arizona to Alberta. Die-off has been reported for several years in Utah. In fact, we visited in the 2004 Cedar City workshop an area that had completely died mysteriously, and it was what I call a clod kicking session. We were up there kicking clods because we couldn't figure out why it had happened. But it's been reported more recently in Colorado. Last year was the first time it's really been reported to those of us that are involved in aspen, and of course the press got a hold of it this summer, and thus all the interest in the press. In Colorado, over 20,000 acres are affected. New survey flights are currently being conducted, and I've talked to some of the people doing those flights, and they are seeing more acres affected in Colorado. This is an example of a 2000 map of the area in southwestern Colorado on the San Juan National Forest. It looks kind of like red speckles here, so you'd think, well, that's not such a really big deal because there's, hundreds of thousands of aspen in this area. When you come in a little closer, the yellow areas here are the aspen dieback. The other colors are other diseases that have been observed from the air. But the aspen dieback, and those are section lines there. So you're beginning to see that we are talking, it doesn't take much, it's 640 acres per section. If you add up the yellow, there are several thousand acres, probably over 10,000 acres affected in this one photo, and this is only a portion of the map. So this gives you an idea that it is a big deal. It is affecting quite a few clones over there. This is an example. Dale showed you an example. This is a little more close up. The overstory is about half dead here. It's rapidly dying. One of the things that is characteristic here is you're still looking at white bark, which means it happened quite rapidly. Bark only persists for a few years after an aspen tree dies before it falls off. So you're looking at white bark, no leaves. If you walk up, you can see that the trees are dead. This slide also is an example of a younger age class that was produced when this power line right away was cut, is unaffected. From a middle ground perspective, there's an aspen harvest unit in the middle of that photo. This is near Mancos, Colorado, where aspen has been commercially harvested for a number of years. The harvest units, for the most part, are unaffected, although there are some diseases in there and some mortality, but for the most part unaffected. But the mature stands around these old harvest units, even though this is some of the most productive sites in the western United States, are dying. When you get up close, you notice that when trees are dying, you see the crowns are very thin, the leaves are quite small. And oftentimes when you look at these trees, you realize they really are affected with a canker. They're dead and just don't know it. Here is some scrapings on the bark on our trip in June to the San Juan, showing that indeed we have infections that are in the process of girdling this tree. Also, poplar borers with the associated weeping of the tree, the sap running down the tree, are also quite prevalent. Often, if there is a previous cohort there, like this sapling-sized cohort, it's unaffected, but the overstory is completely dead. Again, bark is on these trees. They've been dead. They've died within the past probably 3 years. Here's a picture of a stand in Montana, again in the process of dying. The point I wanted to make here was from a different angle we can look at the same stand. Notice the stand on the left. The stand on the left is more of the classic decline. It's been gradually going down over time. It's thinly stalked, but the one on the right there where all the stems died was actually the better stalked stand. Is this drought related? Well, perhaps not in this case, because this was growing in a riparian meadow, and our boots got wet as we walked through this stand. This particular site has all the moisture it needs. So how come some of the aspen are dying? But again, notice on the far right there that the few live stems of younger cohort here remain alive. Here's a situation that kind of shows that a little more completely. If you look closely here, you can see this is a clone that's in decline. It's happened gradually over time. This clone here is slightly different color. It's in the process of being affected. It has those thin crowns, chlorotic leaves. All the stems in that clone are dying right now. But it's probably the healthiest appearing clone and the most well-stalked clone in this group, but the other clones on either side of it are not affected. So here's a case where, again, one clone can be affected, but others are not. So there's a number of research questions, I think, that need to be answered here. Are aspen sprouts really dead? Are aspen roots really dead in the affected stands? And if so, what killed them? John and I were talking before the session started this morning. Below ground investigations are a terrible amount of work, but somebody's got to do it and figure this out. What invasive organisms are present in the dead and dying trees? And is there one that's common or causal, or is it multiple factors acting, similar to what John described? Can die-off epicenters be associated with any climatic conditions on a more general basis? Climatologists need to get involved and look at these things. Is it drought, snowpack, lack of snowpack, extreme temperatures, atmospheric gases, concentrations, so on and so forth? Can die-off be predicted by stand age, growth rate, stalking, or other metrics? Is there any way we can tell what stands are likely to be affected? And can establishing new sprouts prior to dieback in some of these areas, if we can predict where it's liable to occur, actually head it off at the pass and prevent it from occurring to where we have more of a decline, where we're getting a phase shift, but we still have retained the genotype on the side? Is there any relationship between dieback and animal impacts, such as browsing or barking of trees? Could be, but again, this needs to be investigated over a wide spectrum to see how consistent those are and under what circumstances they're contributing.
Okay. Wayne has mostly been talking, I believe that was mostly example from Colorado, correct?
Colorado and Montana.
Colorado and Montana. Going to talk about a few more examples here a little bit closer to home. Been looking mostly within the states of Utah and Nevada, and also in the Bridger-Teton in Wyoming. And that's why Wayne asked me to kind of help, because we were out doing some survey work this year, and I'll describe here in just a minute what we did. A little bit of background first. We've been seeing aspen dieback in aerial surveys since about 2003. It appeared to increase in 2004, and in 2005 we got a pretty substantial amount. There were over 30,000 acres that we could pick up on our forest health protection aerial surveys. on 7 different national forests and adjoining lands, state lands, BLM lands, other places like that. We were seeing some evidence of this either dieback or die-off or whatever it is that we're going to be calling it. However, and I'll show you a picture here in just a minute of the kind of thing that we started to see. We went out in 2005 and field checked some of these sites, and what we were actually seeing on the ground didn't correspond terribly well with what they were defining it as when looking at it from the air. So just this year, we actually are still ongoing with installing some Aspen plots. So the data that I'm going to be giving you here is very preliminary. I just ran a real quick summary of a couple of things. It's still an ongoing project, but we got some evaluation monitoring money from Forest Inventory and Analysis Research Group to go out and try and look at what's going on with these areas. Okay, this is one of our aerial detection survey maps from 2004. Okay, this is actually one of the polygons that they picked up in 2004 in our aerial detection surveys. And they actually labeled it at that point in time as forest tent caterpillar. That's what that FTC stands for. Well, we went out there actually in 2005 and looked at some of those areas, and there was not a forest tent caterpillar anywhere to be found. We did find a whole group of other things, however. Looking at this from a 2005 aerial detection survey, and this is actually the same area. I thought that was supposed to go back. There we go. This is on the Dixie National Forest. This is kind of the edge of the Aquarius Plateau right here, and Cyclone Lake there. This is on the Aquarius Plateau. It's good enough. You notice the size of the polygons increased from 2005 pretty substantially. So we're seeing a lot more in terms of area occupied by this dieback or die-off. And, okay, a few points about aerial detection survey, and Wayne also talked about using that a little bit in Colorado. And basically, we have people up in a light aircraft flying over looking for insect and disease type problems from the air. And there are some drawbacks to doing that type of survey when you're trying to define what's actually out and happening on the ground. One of the problems with that is that what's happening needs to be fairly big. They have to be able to detect it from an airplane. So subtle and smaller things, like some of the things that Wayne pointed out, those relatively subtle changes, you can't pick that up from aerial detection survey. It's also impossible from doing that type of a survey to distinguish a defoliation event from a dieback, possibly leading to a die-off. So you can just tell that there's something going wrong with the trees. It's real hard to specify exactly what that is looking at it from the air. Also, our aerial detection surveys, most years that's actually primarily aimed at picking up bark beetles. And they really haven't looked at aspen in a whole lot of detail up until the last couple of years when I basically kind of nagged them into it. And also the time of year might make a big difference, particularly when dealing with defoliators. If you go out early in the year and the defoliators really haven't gotten going that much yet, they might not be detectable from aerial detection survey. But nonetheless, that's what we had to go on in trying to define where these places were. Okay, a few examples from different places around the Intermountain region. This is from the Dixie National Forest. See a few tree crowns there that look pretty sparse and thin. This is actually some defoliation activity that was going on the Dixie. This is kind of a classic fish lake, edge of the sagebrush, crappy looking aspen clone that is at this point declining. Similar kind of a thing, but not quite as severe from the Manti LaSalle. This is very similar actually to something that Wayne was pointing out, that you can see the overstory material dying off, but you have a pretty good crop of intermediate sized trees that weren't that seriously impacted at this point. Another very similar sort of thing from the Uinta. Notice that the understory trees are still relatively unimpacted by this. This is from the Humboldt Toyabe, and it's a little harder to see in this particular picture, but if you look up into that aspen stand in there, you can see kind of a grayish cast to the trees. And these are trees that are dying back and look very similar. Another one, this is actually very close to where we're going on our field trip up in Tony Grove. And also on the Bridger Teton, some actually fairly dramatic mortality going on in the Bridger Teton right now. Okay, so this is some of the data that we collected just this year. And the light blue bars are mortality of individual overstory stems. And the purple stuff is stuff that was showing moderate to heavy damage. So something that was pretty substantially impacting the health of overstory stems are shown in the purple bars. And across the bottom there, it's just different locations throughout the Intermountain region. I'd like to draw your attention to that right-hand bar. That's the overall average of the data that we collected just this year. We had roughly close to 30% mortality in these trees. Initially, you might think, okay, 30% mortality, that doesn't really sound that bad. But as Wayne pointed out earlier, this is 30% mortality that really is only happening within the last couple of years. Aspen sloughs off its bark within a couple of years, and we weren't looking at the older dead snags. We were only looking at the stuff that's still retaining bark. So you have 30% mortality, pretty substantial hit in these areas that we were picking up in aerial detection surveys that have died within probably about the last 3 years or so. So that's a pretty good chunk out of these stands that's missing at this point. Also, there was roughly, on average, about 50% serious damage due to one agent or another on these overstory trees. So that's a pretty substantial hunk of these aspen stands that have some serious impact by damaging agents. I wanted to break one area down a little bit just to make one point here. This is one specific set of plots on one ranger district on the Dixie National Forest. I'd like to draw your attention there to plot number 1. In that particular plot, the actual amount of mortality was very light. Where this was an area where we had fairly heavy defoliation going on, but there wasn't really a whole lot of trees dying at this point in time. And to compare that with, for example, plot number 5, that's an area where it had multiple interacting agents. There had been some defoliation. There was a ton of canker diseases. And basically, every stem in that stand was pretty much killed. And the point that I was hoping to make is that even within these areas that appear to be pretty dramatically impacted right at this point in time, there's going to be a whole range of conditions. There's going to be some areas that are fairly lightly impacted, and there are going to be some areas that are fairly heavily hammered. Okay, we also looked at the regeneration a bit, and that upper slide there just is a classic trees per acre of how many stems of aspen that were present in the stands that we looked at. There was a pretty wide range. The Manti-LaSalle, I think, kind of really stuck up in that there were, even in areas that looked like they were pretty heavily hit by a die-off type event, you still had a pretty good crop of regeneration going on in there. Other areas, like some of the stuff over in Nevada, the Ruby Mountains, Austin, and Fish Lake, even areas that looked like they had a pretty heavy die-off type event, there was actually fairly light regeneration. Even within those regeneration stems that we did have present, if you look at the bottom slide there, in some cases we had well over 50% of those little regeneration stems that had some significant damage from forest insects and diseases and other damaging agents. So even when you have stems that are present that are your potential new crop of trees, there's still quite a few things that are working on those and impacting those as well. Okay, so what agents are involved? There's some defoliators, cankers, borers, of course a lot of animal damage, being that it's aspen, and a few things that I just kind of chucked together into the miscellaneous category. Fungal defoliators, these are very common, but they rarely were associated with the more serious damage categories. This slide up here is Marsanina leaf blight, one of the more common leaf blight type organisms. Particularly on young material, we saw a lot of this shoot blight. Thought that this one was kind of interesting. We only saw it in one area, actually in Nevada, but this is Balampsura leaf rust. And it's an organism that we might have found a new race of it because it's really not supposed to be something that impacts aspen very much in the Intermountain region. It is in the Pacific Northwest on hybrid poplars, and it can also impact a lot of willow species, but it's really not something that's on the host list for impacting aspen very much in the Intermountain region. But nonetheless, we did find it present in one area where it was real close to a lot of willow that was heavily impacted by this disease. Okay, insect defoliators. Particularly in southern and central Utah, we had multiple fairly consequential outbreaks of insect defoliators. Two of the bigger ones that we had were the large aspen tortrix and the aspen two-leaf tire. And we had a lot of acres of damage by those two particular insects. One of the things that I thought was very interesting in a lot of young material is we saw a phenomenal amount of aphids in some places. Aphids on aspen are something that's supposed to be just an occasional damage. You see a little bit of nibbling out on the tips of branches, but never anything that really causes a whole bunch of damage. In a few places, particularly in Nevada, but also in Utah as well, we found spots where aphids were damaging the trees enough that they were basically defoliating all the young material. Don't know long term what that's going to be doing, but that's an amazing amount of aphid damage out there. Okay, Wayne mentioned canker diseases, and these are present on nearly every plot. This one is sooty bark canker over here, and this is an example of Cytospora canker. Dale mentioned that I worked with canker diseases in graduate school, and I did work with Cytospora canker. And it really is, to me, pretty scary how much Cytospora canker we are finding on our plots. The Cytospora canker is ordinarily what's considered to be a stress-related disease. It only really impacts small trees and branches and that kind of thing. But on our plots this year, we were seeing large overstory stems being killed by Cytospora canker. So how is this relatively weak parasite out there killing large overstory trees? Well, when we figure that out, we'll let you know. Okay, Wayne also mentioned borers, the two principal ones, but this is poplar borer. There also is a cerambycid type beetle called metallic poplar borer, which is a cambial feeder. It's actually capable of doing quicker and more significant damage than the poplar borer. We found a lot of both of those this year. We also had some other spots where we had some more kind of miscellaneous sort of damages. In some places we found stuff that looked like this. You look up into the trees and you just see these little black leaves. If you get a hold of those, that was actually some frost damage from a late into the year killing frost. Also, we had some cases where we saw trees that had very small leaves and looked like they had thin, weak crowns. In some cases, when we got up to those, we got leaves off that had classic kind of marginal scorch, usually indicative of drought stress. A few other new and interesting sort of things. Ambrosia beetles, what this picture is up in that corner, are ordinarily something that's on the host list, that it could be something that's potentially happening on aspen. Ordinarily not much of a damage aid, but we found ambrosia beetles hitting aspen in way more areas than really there should be ambrosia beetles out there. So there's actually quite a bit of this going on. We've had a number of different gall-forming insects that we picked up. This one is actually a twig gall fly. Also in a number of places, a very good year for aerophyte mites causing deformations on aspen stems. And this is actually a cottonwood leaf skeletonizer that we found actually impacting aspen. It's one of the examples of an entirely new thing. This isn't really even on the host lists for aspen. Ordinarily, it's something that's just found on cottonwood. We found a couple of other things like that, however. Okay, I wanted to, in closing here, say thanks to my crew, 2 of which are here today. Very hardworking bunch, and without them and their mad GPS skills, I'd probably still be doing this somewhere in Nevada, trying to figure out where the heck I am and how to get to the plot. And also thank you to all of you for your attention today.
One over there.
Is there any kind of dieback or die-up, such as you're seeing here, being seen in the Great Lakes states?
I'm not familiar with the Great Lakes, but I've talked to the Canadians and they're seeing it in Quebec. It's behaving a little differently, but it's still very much the same symptoms with a lot of the same agents that John just described.
There have been a few cases. It's a very different type of system, and it's difficult to reference from someone who has really only worked in the West, but other than just to recognize that there has been similar sort of thing going on.
There's another one got this.
John, you put some estimates up for mortality and damage currently.
Right.
Are you aware of any similar data sets from 25 or 50 years ago?
I am unaware of anything from that time frame.
Just curious if that gorgeous that.
Yeah, that's one of the things about this is that the historic literature doesn't describe any kind of rapid die-off like this that has occurred on as large a scale as what we're seeing. So that's how we're kind of plowing the ground. Charles?
Yeah, well, just to mention something that just hit me. I mean, basically what you're getting in a lot of these cases is they haven't regenerated for 100 and some years for various causes that we're talking about. Is they just be getting to they're getting old, old age, everything attacks them and they're just dying now.
That could very well be a contributing factor.
One table in my dissertation, I did this 20% random sample north of the park. What's interesting is the ages of the oldest trees in the stand that I sampled. And this is a place where it regenerated at different times in the past. They're all different ages. And I sort of had the idea there, which you just jogged my memory, that there's no data on this, but maybe not all clones, maybe they don't live to 150 or 200 years. Some die out at 100 years, some die out at 80 years, some die out at 60 years. But in one case, the oldest heads in this clone were only 40 years old.
Yeah.
Just turning over.
And I think that raises a good point. Is we tend to think of ecosystems as going along and changing gradually. And in fact, I think that oftentimes they change. They undergo phase shifts, if you will, and that could be what we're looking at. To me, the disturbing thing about this is that if we're losing roots, that's something that is probably going to change the amount of aspen that's on landscapes, especially if we totally lose the clones. And to me, that's an important aspect of this to look at is in what percentage of the cases is that the case, and in what percentage of the cases are we seeing what would otherwise be described, I guess, as a mechanism of normal generational turnover of aspen, that we're just going through a phase where the old generation is dying out, as Charles mentioned, and a new generation is coming in. So to me, that's one of the important things we need to distinguish is how much of this total die-off or disappearance of aspen clones are we really seeing out there, and how to distinguish it.
Has there been much research on dormancy of roots, like how long they've been dormant for, what portion of the clone might have?
Well, I think I've done some of that in some of our work that we did earlier with looking at roots in persistence following clear-cut harvest or clear fell harvest. And basically, if you don't have photosynthetic input, those roots aren't going to last more than a few years. Because they have respiration loads just like any other living thing. And if there's not input coming in, they're just not going to survive very long. So I would say no more than 4 or 5 years, and you're going to, without any photosynthetic input, and you're going to lose the roots. I think we're being given the hook here. So.
Thanks.